In the winter of 1867, the prestigious Ashford Academy for Young Ladies stood like a fortress against the Vermont mountains, its imposing stone walls hiding secrets that would make even the bravest souls question everything they thought they knew about respectability and honor. But there was something deeply unsettling about the building's design, something that visitors noticed immediately but dared not question. Not a single window in the entire main structure faced north. Not one, and those who dared to ask why were met with nervous glances and hurried changes of subject. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Marlowe and the dark discovery that would shake the very foundations of this respected institution, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our most chilling stories. Tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love hearing from our international audience of mystery lovers. And if you're brave enough to hear what really happened behind those deliberately positioned walls, give this video a like to support our content. Now, let me take you back to that harsh Vermont winter, when the truth about Ashford Academy would finally come to light. According to the fragmented accounts passed down through generations of local families, and the whispered stories that still circulate in the mountain villages, what happened at that prestigious school was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The town of Millbrook, Vermont, nestled in the Green Mountains about 20 miles south of Montpelier, was the kind of place where old money met older secrets. In 1867, the community of roughly 800 souls prided itself on its moral rectitude and unwavering devotion to Protestant values. The bitter winter winds that swept down from the peaks carried with them the scent of pine and the promise of isolation, perfect conditions for those who preferred their business conducted away from prying eyes. Magistrate Edmund Ashford had arrived in Millbrook 15 years earlier, in 1852, with impeccable credentials from Boston and enough capital to establish what would become Vermont's most exclusive academy for young ladies. The imposing three-story granite building rose from a carefully chosen plot of land on the town's eastern edge, its Gothic revival architecture speaking of permanence and respectability. Local craftsmen had worked for 2 years to complete the structure, following Ashford's exacting specifications down to the smallest detail. The academy's reputation grew quickly throughout New England. Daughters of prominent families from Boston, Hartford, and even New York were sent to receive their education under Ashford's watchful eye. The curriculum emphasized moral instruction, classical languages, and the refined arts befitting young ladies of society. Parents paid handsomely for the privilege, trusting that their daughters would emerge as paragons of virtue and accomplishment. But it was Catherine Marlowe who would first notice what others had been trained to ignore. Catherine had arrived in Millbrook in November of 1867, fresh from her teaching position at a girls' school in Concord, Massachusetts. At 28, she possessed both the intellectual curiosity that made her an excellent educator and the independence of spirit that would prove dangerous in a place like Ashford Academy. Her appointment as the new literature and history instructor had been arranged through a network of educational contacts, and she approached her new position with enthusiasm and high hopes. The Abenaki people had called this land home for countless generations before European settlement, and their presence could still be felt in the stone circles and burial mounds that dotted the surrounding forest. Local settlers had learned to avoid certain areas, respecting boundaries that seemed to have been established by some ancient understanding. The land where Ashford Academy now stood had once been sacred ground, a place where the Abenaki had honored their ancestors for hundreds of years. Catherine's first week at the academy passed without incident, but by her second Monday, she began to notice the peculiar lighting in the main building. The corridors seemed perpetually dim, and the classrooms required oil lamps even during the brightest part of the day. As someone accustomed to the well-lit spaces of her previous school, she found herself studying the building's layout with growing puzzlement. It was during her third week that curiosity finally overcame politeness. On a particularly bright December morning, Catherine walked the perimeter of the building, counting windows and noting their orientation. What she discovered made her pause in the snow-covered yard, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she stared up at the imposing structure. The building's southern, eastern, and western faces were punctuated by tall, arched windows that let in abundant natural light. But the entire northern wall, a span of nearly 200 feet, was completely blank. Not a single window, not even a small opening, interrupted the massive expanse of granite blocks. The architectural choice was so deliberate, so absolute, that it couldn't possibly be accidental. That evening, Catherine mentioned her observation to Mrs. Helena Whitmore, the Academy's head of domestic operations and one of the few staff members who had been present since the school's founding. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she busied herself with unnecessary tasks as she spoke. Magistrate Ashford was very specific about the building's design, she said, her voice carefully neutral. He consulted with architects from Boston to ensure the structure would be both beautiful and practical. I'm sure he had his reasons. But Catherine noticed how Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as she arranged papers on her desk, and how she avoided meeting her eyes during the conversation. The older woman's discomfort was palpable, and it only served to deepen Catherine's curiosity about the building's unusual architecture. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Young Sarah Pemberton, a 15-year-old student from a prominent Hartford family, had been found unconscious in the third-floor hallway just before dawn. She had apparently been sleepwalking, something that had never happened before, and had somehow managed to reach the very end of the northern corridor, where she had collapsed against the blank wall. When Sarah regained consciousness, she spoke in fragmented sentences about voices calling from the ground and spirits trying to come home. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Thornfield, diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest. But Sarah's words had been overheard by several other students, and whispers began to spread through the Academy's halls. The incident with Sarah Pemberton marked the beginning of a series of strange occurrences that would plague the Academy throughout the winter of 1867. Students began reporting difficulty sleeping, particularly those whose rooms were located on the northern side of the building. They complained of sounds, not from within the school, but from somewhere beyond the walls, as if something were trying to reach them from the other side. Catherine found herself drawn into these concerns, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had witnessed the deliberate architectural choices that seemed to be at the heart of the disturbances. She began to research the history of the land, spending her free time in the town's small library and speaking with longtime residents who remembered the area before the Academy's construction. What she discovered troubled her deeply. The land had indeed been sacred to the Abenaki people, serving as a burial ground for tribal elders and spiritual leaders. Local records, sparse though they were, indicated that the native families had been relocated during the early 1850s, around the same time that Magistrate Ashford had begun purchasing property in the area. Thomas Hawthorne, an elderly man who had worked as a surveyor during the school's construction, proved to be Catherine's most valuable source of information. Now in his 70s and living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, Thomas had been reluctant to speak about his experiences until Catherine assured him that she was only interested in understanding the building's unusual design. "That man Ashford," Thomas said, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of hot cider. "He was particular about everything. Had me survey that land 3 times before he was satisfied. But it wasn't just the building he was concerned about, it was what lay beneath it." Thomas explained that the construction had uncovered numerous artifacts and burial sites, all of which Ashford had ordered to be carefully documented and removed. But instead of treating these discoveries with the respect they deserved, Ashford had approached them with the calculating eye of a businessman. "He brought in men from Boston," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Men who knew how to appraise such things. They came at night, did their work in secret, and left before dawn. And always, they worked on the northern side of the property." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing picture, but Catherine needed more evidence before she could fully understand what had happened on the grounds of Ashford Academy. As winter deepened, Catherine's investigation took on new urgency. The strange incidents at the academy were becoming more frequent and more disturbing. Students reported seeing figures moving beyond the northern wall during the darkest hours before dawn, and several had experienced vivid dreams of being called to leave the building and walk into the forest. Catherine decided to examine the academy's financial records, which were kept in Magistrate Ashford's private office. Her position as a senior instructor gave her access to certain administrative areas, and she used this privilege to study the documents that might explain the school's unusual construction choices. What she found among the carefully organized files was a series of invoices and receipts that painted a picture of systematic deception. The construction costs for the academy had been significantly higher than comparable buildings of the time, but the additional expenses were not attributed to superior materials or craftsmanship. Instead, they appeared to be related to site preparation and ground clearance, work that had been performed by specialized contractors from Boston and New York. More troubling still were the receipts for archaeological consultation and artifact preservation services. These expenses, totaling thousands of dollars, had been paid to individuals and companies that specialized in the acquisition and sale of Native American artifacts to private collectors and museums. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications. Magistrate Ashford had not simply built his academy on sacred ground. He had systematically pillaged the burial sites and sold the artifacts for profit. The absence of northern windows wasn't about architectural aesthetics. It was about concealing the evidence of his crimes. But the full scope of Ashford's operation would only become clear when Catherine discovered a hidden compartment in the office desk, concealed behind a false back panel. Inside, she found a leather-bound ledger that documented transactions spanning more than a decade. The entries were written in Ashford's precise handwriting, recording the sale of ceremonial objects, pottery, weapons, and even human remains to collectors throughout the eastern United States. The prices paid were substantial, enough to fund not only the academy's construction, but also Ashford's comfortable lifestyle and growing influence in the community. Each entry was accompanied by detailed descriptions of the artifacts and their provenance, making it clear that Ashford understood the cultural and spiritual significance of what he was destroying. He had not acted out of ignorance or accident. He had deliberately desecrated sacred sites for financial gain. The discovery of the ledger filled Catherine with a mixture of horror and determination. She now understood why no windows faced north. Ashford had wanted to ensure that no one could witness the ongoing excavations and removals that continued even after the academy's opening. The northern wall served as a barrier between the respectable world of education and the shameful reality of cultural destruction. But Catherine's investigation had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Whitmore had observed her increased interest in the building's history, and word of her inquiries had reached Magistrate Ashford himself. On a bitterly cold January evening, Catherine found herself summoned to his private office for what he described as a routine discussion about curriculum matters. Ashford was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He greeted Catherine with formal politeness, but she could sense the tension beneath his composed exterior. The office was elegantly furnished, with expensive carpets and artwork that spoke of considerable wealth that Catherine now knew had been acquired through the systematic pillaging of sacred sites. "Miss Marlowe," Ashford began, settling behind his massive oak desk, "I understand you've been asking questions about our building's design. While I appreciate intellectual curiosity, I must remind you that certain matters are best left to those with the proper authority to address them." Catherine felt her heart racing, but she maintained her composure. "I was simply curious about the architectural choices, sir. As someone who spends considerable time in the building, I noticed the unusual window placement." Ashford's eyes narrowed slightly. The design was carefully planned to optimize the educational environment. The northern exposure in this climate can be harsh and distracting, I trust that explanation is sufficient. But Catherine saw something else in his expression, a wariness that suggested he knew she had discovered more than she was admitting. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Ashford making subtle threats about the importance of discretion and loyalty to the institution. As Catherine left the office, she realized that her investigation had put her in genuine danger. Ashford was not simply a man with a shameful secret. He was someone who had built his entire life on the systematic destruction of sacred sites and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. He would not hesitate to protect his interests by any means necessary. That night, Catherine made copies of the most incriminating pages from the ledger, hiding them in her personal belongings. She also wrote a detailed letter to her former colleague in Concord, explaining her discoveries and requesting help in documenting the evidence. If something happened to her, she wanted to ensure that the truth about Ashford Academy would eventually come to light. The confrontation came on a February morning when Catherine arrived at the academy to find that her belongings had been searched. Someone had gone through her room during the night, clearly looking for evidence of her investigation. The copies of the ledger pages were gone, and her letter to Concord had been intercepted. Magistrate Ashford was waiting in the main hallway, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of casual conversation. His face was cold and calculating as he approached her, and Catherine could see that he had reached a decision about how to handle the threat she represented. "Miss Marlowe," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his way, "I believe your employment here has run its course. You will pack your remaining belongings and leave the premises immediately. Your services are no longer required." But Catherine had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment. She had not only made copies of the ledger, she had also shared her findings with Thomas Hawthorne, who had agreed to serve as a witness to Ashford's crimes. More importantly, she had discovered that several of the current students were daughters of families who had been directly affected by the displacement of Native American communities. "Before I leave," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt, "I think you should know that others are aware of what you've done here. The systematic desecration of burial sites, the theft of sacred artifacts, the deliberate displacement of indigenous families, all of it has been documented." Ashford's composure cracked for the first time. "You have no proof of anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Catherine reached into her coat and produced a folded paper, not the original ledger pages, but a detailed inventory she had compiled of the items described in Ashford's records. "I have enough proof to interest the federal authorities," she said. "The Bureau of Indian Affairs has been investigating similar cases throughout New England. They would be very interested in your business dealings." The truth was that Catherine had not yet contacted any federal authorities, but she had learned enough about Ashford's operation to understand its vulnerability. The man had built his fortune on crimes that were not only morally reprehensible, but also legally questionable under federal treaties with Native American tribes. Ashford stared at her for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" Catherine's demands were simple, but comprehensive. She wanted Ashford to cease all further excavations on the property and to return any artifacts still in his possession to the appropriate tribal authorities. She also insisted that he provide financial compensation to the families who had been displaced during the academy's construction, and that he publicly acknowledge the historical significance of the land. Most importantly, she demanded that windows be installed on the northern wall, not as a cosmetic improvement, but as a symbol of transparency and respect for the sacred ground that lay beyond. Ashford initially resisted, but Catherine's threat to expose his crimes to federal authorities and the families of his students proved persuasive. Over the following months, he quietly complied with her demands, though he attempted to frame the changes as improvements to the building's design rather than acknowledgments of wrongdoing. The installation of the northern windows in the spring of 1868 marked the end of the most shameful chapter in Ashford Academy's history. The students noticed the improved lighting immediately, and the strange incidents that had plagued the school throughout the winter gradually subsided. Catherine remained at the academy for 2 more years, overseeing the implementation of the changes she had demanded. She worked closely with members of the local Abenaki community to ensure that the returned artifacts were properly cared for and that the sacred sites were treated with appropriate respect. Thomas Hawthorne, now in his mid-70s, played a crucial role in documenting the locations of the burial sites and helping to identify the cultural significance of the artifacts that were returned. His detailed knowledge of the pre-construction landscape proved invaluable in understanding the full scope of what had been lost. The financial compensation that Ashford provided to the displaced families was substantial, though it could never fully address the cultural and spiritual damage that had been done. Several families were able to return to the area, and they worked with Catherine to establish a small memorial garden on the academy grounds, honoring the ancestors whose remains had been disturbed. In 1870, Catherine accepted a position at a college in Boston, but she maintained correspondence with the community in Millbrook for the rest of her life. She never married, dedicating herself instead to education and advocacy for Indigenous rights, work that had been inspired by her experiences at Ashford Academy. Magistrate Ashford died in 1874, taking most of his secrets with him. The academy continued to operate under new management, and the northern windows remained a permanent reminder of the importance of facing difficult truths rather than hiding from them. This story reminds us that the most elegant facades can conceal the most shameful realities, and that true respectability comes not from wealth or social position, but from the courage to confront our past and make amends for our wrongs. The windows that now face north at Ashford Academy served as a daily reminder that transparency and honesty are the foundations of any institution that truly serves the greater good. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that Catherine's actions were sufficient to address the injustices that had been committed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden secrets and moral courage, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates stories of historical mystery and justice. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully it's been hidden away.